Psalm 23, a Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This most famous of all the Psalms presents God as a host who welcomes his people into his care and into his overflowing abundance. And two images are used by the psalmist to convey this. The first is the much loved image of God as the supreme good shepherd who cares for his people, and his people as the sheep who entrust themselves to his care. The second image depicts believers as travelers who pass through dangerous territory, but on arriving at their destination, recognize the providence of God in keeping them safe. I love the climax of this story of the traveler, which we see in verse 6, the last verse of the psalm. It says, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The Hebrew word, which is translated as follow, is a really interesting one, as it suggests that the person was rushing on their journey, believing that they were being chased by their enemies. But on arriving at their destination, they turn around and see that actually it wasn't their enemies that were following them, but God's goodness and mercy. It's a drama that reminds us of so much of our experience of life. We're filled with anxiety about some possible future event, an interview, a medical procedure, an important task that we have to perform, whatever it is. Our imagination is running wild. We're thinking of many different possible futures, and each one of them is bad, and each new possible future we invent is worse than the previous one. It seems that positive expectations have been banished from our minds altogether, and we're on a spiral towards catastrophe. In hindsight, however, when the event has been and gone, we can see that in the overwhelming number of cases, our anxiety simply wasn't justified. The horrors that we imagined never materialized, and in fact, we can trace the paths of God's goodness and mercy through the whole experience. And this takes us to the heart of the theme of this psalm, which is security. Security is not only the theme of Psalm 23, but it can also be said to be one of the main themes of our psychology. I would suggest that this is why this psalm is so loved. It's precisely because it speaks to our greatest and most constant anxiety, our anxiety around security. And security, of course, comes in many forms. There's the obvious one, physical security, to be safe from being physically hurt. But then there's also relational security, the need to know that we're not going to be abandoned by those we love, or that those we love won't be taken away from us by illness or by accident. There's financial security, the security of our property, the security of our culture, and the security of our data. Sadly, also, much is said today of food security, clothing security, and energy security. What this tells us is that there are an awful lot of potential reasons to feel insecure, a lot of reasons to be anxious. And this is very much more of a problem for us today than it ever was for the psalmist and his contemporaries. Insecurity is the anxiety of our age. Before I get further into this, it is worth pointing out, I think, that our physical security has never actually been better. Humans are much less violent today than at any point in our history. Research has shown that since the 15th century, the chance of any human being killed through violence has been decreasing dramatically. You'd be forgiven for being surprised at this because we see so much violence, of course, on the news. And I guess this is one indicator why physical security remains such a source of anxiety for us. We are inundated with information from all over the world, especially at the moment, that tells us of so much suffering, so much violence. And we internalize these experiences. The violence of the faraway places becomes our anxiety, an anxiety that we will suffer that kind of violence also. The suffering of others becomes our fear. But it's a fact that over the centuries, our insecurities have multiplied as our lives have become more complicated. We have more technology to grasp, more knowledge to learn, more friendships to maintain, more places to visit, more communities to belong to, more jobs to master, more travelling to undertake, more possessions to hold on to. As our lives have become more complex and as more concerns have been added to our day-to-day lives, so we have accumulated more reasons to worry about our security. Our ancestors, well, they never had to worry about making fools of themselves on social media or having their identity stolen. Security and the things that threaten it preoccupy us. And so the last part of the verse 6 that I read earlier, has even greater resonance today than it did even for those ancient Israelites who first read it. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The house of the Lord is a reference to the tabernacle or the temple, the place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and the place that was most closely linked to the promises of God, and in particular to his promise to be present with his people. Where the ark was, God was there. And so the house of the Lord was where the psalmist knew God's presence most intensely. And because of that, it was the place of greatest security for him. In fact, the word for the space within the temple, sanctuary, has become synonymous with security. One thing to add at this point is that the word forever at the end of this verse, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, it shouldn't really be there. The psalmist is not thinking of being kept secure after death. He's very much concerned with this life and the idea that he will be kept secure by the Lord for the rest of his life. But what about us? Where can we know this same security? How can we know, or where can we know, this same divine presence? Well, let's fast forward quite a few hundred years to the early church in Jerusalem. The first Christian martyr was a believer called Stephen, and he was put to death for teaching that since Jesus was risen from the dead, the presence of the Lord was no longer to be associated with the temple in Jerusalem, but has now exploded throughout the entire world. You can read what he said in the book of Acts, chapter 7. His point is that there is no longer just one place, one holy place, one place where God is. But since Jesus is Lord of all places are now holy. The God who is our security is everywhere, and his house, well, it's where you are right now. It's true that this doesn't give us greater security against data breaches or identity theft, but it does make us more secure in our identity. We are those with whom God dwells. That is who we are. We are those who dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of our lives. That is who we are. One of the problems with having such complex lives is that we get overwhelmed by it all and start investing our identity in these things, our possessions, our social media, performance on social media, or our performance in our job. Our concerns may well be important, and many of them really are. But even if they are taken away from us, who we are, well, that remains. We are those with whom God dwells. And this is security. Your identity, who you are, cannot be taken away from you. It is held by God, kept safe by God, treasured by God, and will be all your days.